As you know, the focus of this is on stress, anxiety, and burnout. And I want to just put burnout particularly in perspective. The reason that this mentions stress and anxiety also is that there are obviously some similarities. You don't get burnout or anxiety without stress, and so and sometimes, but not always, there is a transition from stress through anxiety to burnout. I do want to make something clear, though, about anxiety, and the reason that I mentioned that in the title, and that is that anxiety is kind of interesting because it is a form of stress that um, really has no immediate trigger. In other words, if you are um, sitting there one morning with your coffee, wondering why you're not sleeping well, and you can put a cause to it, then that really subsumes under the heading of a stress-related situation. But quite often with anxiety, whatever caused the original stress has disappeared. So people with anxiety are particularly it's particularly useful to use the techniques I'm going to be talking about because they often don't know, can't remember, can't immediately connect the original cause of the stress. And yet there they are with anxiety. So it's a kind of a leftover process. And it has similarities to burnout. Burnout, as you probably know, is a very it's just it's a serious epidemic at this point. Um, you're talking about, let me just see if I can, just to give you a little example there. We have, these are just two surveys that related to that. Two other big surveys were, one was done by Microsoft, that was global, and they found globally that on average 50% of adult professionals reported having had or actually being in a state of burnout. And then Deloitte did a huge survey, very, very well, very good science actually, and they found that 77% of US professionals have experienced burnout at their current job. That's three quarters. Now, just to add a bit more perspective to this, if you haven't had burnout or you haven't had close contact with people with burnout, sometimes people don't realize how incredibly pernicious it is. I mean, it goes through your whole life. And back a long time ago, when sex was safe and skydiving was dangerous, I was an entrepreneur, and I took a number of my crazy inventions and to become global leaders in their field. One of these was this rather strange looking device. Um, and it's a microphone, and it's a studio quality microphone. You can stick it on a piano. Um, in the last few years of his performing life, Frank Sinatra wouldn't go on stage unless this was the microphone on his piano. And from Moody Blues to Opryland to Radio City Music Hall to, I mean, at least 1,000 well-known names. So that was my other crazy invention was in medical ultrasound. Not quite so sexy and definitely a little bit difficult to describe in a few words. But the bottom line is that when I'd moved to the States and I had developed a network, a distribution of my products to over 35 countries. Had an office in England, an office in the US here in Florida, and a number of things came together at one point. It was this time of year when I went to trade circles, to trade conferences, trade shows, that kind of thing. And that was a sort of very very exciting month of the year, but I started in Chicago, and I flew to England, I flew to Frankfurt, I flew to Tokyo, and all this was done pretty much non-stop. And a number of things happened with the family, with a couple of other things, and I ended up with burnout. I mean, big time. This came on in a matter of weeks around these other issues. And so sometimes burnout can be defined in a way that describes the causes of the burnout. In other words, sometimes there can be a very discrete kind of reason why people get burnt out. But that experience for me was dramatic. I couldn't sleep. I had absolutely no motivation to do anything. I had to stop myself from making any serious decisions because I didn't trust the way I was thinking. And I did something which is very common with people with burnout and high degrees of stress and anxiety. I pushed away the very people that could have helped me. And so, it that there's no doubt in my mind how serious burnout can be, and it can last a long time. One of my clients actually had his description was that he had had burnout for over 2 years, and it was very difficult for him to function. He hadn't had a job for nearly that length of time. And so it can be a major deal because it's one of those words that's kind of thrown around in a rather casual kind of way sometimes, but it can be, into the levels of PTSD. And it doesn't really, it has some things in common with PTSD, but one of the things it does have is the potential seriousness of um, of the way that burnout can influence us. Um, so possible symptoms of burnout, just very briefly. You're talking really about, firstly, the medical profession does not really accept burnout as a discrete disease or disorder, right? They prefer to subsume it under the heading of work-related stress. And I believe that this is an inadequate description of what burnout is all about. And one of the reasons that I think we have to dig a little bit deeper than just saying, "Oh, it's stress," is how we define stress. And I think it's quite important to get that definition fairly precise. And I think of it as when our perception of our resources is that they're not sufficient to meet the demands that we face, right? When we have inadequate resources to meet a challenge. So that means that there are two factors involved in the burnout. One is the nature of the challenge, and the second is our perception of our resources to meet it. And the reason that this is an important definition is in the beta testing for the program that I'm running called Banish Burnout, which is to help. That's a coaching program. One of the things that I found in that beta test was that for some people, as with myself, there are very discrete factors which came into play regarding getting burnt out. But for a lot of people, that's not the case. Sometimes you can say, okay, so 6, 9, 12 months ago, um, we didn't know each other. Now, why do you choose to come to me now? What has changed over the past 9 months that has caused you to now think that you have burnout and that it's time to get it treated? And when you dig deeper, quite often there's not very much that's changed in that person's life. And so burnout can be a result of somebody's perceptions of the facilities they have, the tools they have, has changed, has decreased. Perhaps something else in their life has come along that's made them more vulnerable, so that exactly the same stressor now causes burnout when previously it didn't. So the fact that there is quite a lot of well, the medical profession just subsume it under stress means there is a good niche here for coaches because if you have burnout, you really might be searching for a burnout therapist, a burnout coach, but very few people really make it clear that the way they coach burnout is specific to that particular condition. So it's a good niche for people to look at because firstly, when you're looking at your niche and you're looking at your potential client base, your avatar, you're going to check three boxes, really, aren't you? That this is a field that you want to be in. So when you're choosing your niche, you're thinking, okay, this is something that I can get fairly passionate about. And secondly, the client base that you're looking at must be easy to reach. So people that are acutely isolated are probably going to be a difficult avatar for you to reach. And then the third is that they have to have the resources to pay you to coach them. So the world is replete with life coaches who have something they're passionate about, but it's aimed at a field which is not particularly affluent. So one of the positive things about looking at burnout as a coaching topic is that you're reaching an audience that can afford to the services that you want to offer. In other words, we might be looking at well, you tell me what sorts of areas do you think what kinds of clients or people, potential clients, are most likely to be to get burnt out? What kind of, just put something in the chat, what you think of the most likely areas of professions to suffer from burnout? Any ideas? That's very interesting, Sarah. I'll come back to that in just a second. Corporate professionals, healthcare workers. Healthcare, a big deal. I mean, particularly after COVID, well, during and after COVID. Um, our daughter is actually a labor and delivery nurse. Those of you in the US may remember there was a hospital that had to turn the whole of its ground floor of the parking garage into a COVID facility. And that hospital is where my wife and my daughter works. And in that, she was really could give a very vivid description of the problems of burnout during that period. So healthcare professionals, absolutely. Um, Interesting and sometimes I think a little counterintuitive. Sarah says working mothers, and it is interesting that women are more prone to burnout than men. And it's not really surprising, is it? If you have two professionals in a relationship with a family, it is more often that the mother, wife, woman of the family is going to be taking the brunt of a problem if something occurs. So one of the kids has to go to emergency room or whatever it is, and it's more often than not the woman of the household who will be taking care of that. So there are other reasons actually which um, come into that process. The women traditionally have a different worldview than men have. And that's not entirely surprising when you think of, the nature, the biology, the process of being a mother. And sometimes that environment is more difficult to deal with in the context of professional life versus home life. Anyway, some great ideas there. So other things that take into account artists and performers, Akem says that's interesting. Yep, absolutely. And if you wanted to pursue that in any greater depth, one of the things you can have a look at is the areas, the professions that are most liable to have high rates of suicide. So that dentists are very high up on the list there, veterinarians, people in the financial services, not necessarily, your local banker, but people who perhaps trade on the stock exchange, trade particularly complex options and forex and that kind of thing. So there's a huge range to think of. So moving back to burnout and the processes involved in it. So one thing that's important to realize is the difference between our perception and our reality. As coaches, we often rush to help clients eliminate stressors. But of course, when you're looking at burnout, it's worth bearing in mind that we can also spend some energy looking at the issue of perception of our own resources. So one of the things that we can have a look at first is we have two different modes of thinking about the world, anything in the world. And one of these modes is analytical and deductive thinking. Now, I've got three granddaughters, and I've spent a lot of time with them since they were born. And as soon as they could really recognize, their focus becomes obvious, and they can actually start to communicate with you. Every day they would come to me with some new thing, and it could be anything. It could be an idea, it could be an object, and that you could see that they were trying to fit this into what they already had, like a jigsaw puzzle piece. They were putting it into the other pieces of knowledge that they had. Now, if you think about what that process is, it is creativity. And it is a very divergent way of thinking. So this is an important concept in what we're talking about, and I think in coaching, that one of these ways of looking at the world is convergent and one is divergent. So when we're born, we have no history. We haven't got anything to compare the new object. So this may be a computer mouse to me right now, but perhaps, when I was 3 years old, if they'd had computer mice, it might have been a telephone. It could have been all sorts of different things other than just what it appears to be. And that's a very divergent way of looking at the world. That's making connections in a way that as adults we have largely lost. So as adults, we lose that very creative way of looking at the world, and we tend to become much more analytical and deductive. And if you think about the challenges that you get from day to day at home and in your work life, they are often related to things that you have to analyze and think about. Even switching on the television, you have people telling you that if you don't take out this insurance on your water pipes, then you're in for thousands of dollars when something goes wrong, or all sorts of other ways in which you need some more life insurance, some more death insurance, some more every sort of insurance. Everything that gets thrown at you in that way, with a little bit of an edge to try and scare you a bit, that's all very analytical and deductive. And it's not really surprising that we've become socialized to think that way, because the human body hasn't changed significantly in many, many tens of thousands of years. But the complexity of the world we live in has changed just enormously. If I look back, um, my dad was actually born in 1896. And yes, I know you're thinking, God, Andre must be about 100 years old. That's ridiculous. Oh, no, I could actually see that. Yeah, he could be. So anyway, that was the era in which he was born. And he was just about the right age to join the First World War, which is where he would have seen his first aeroplane. And it would have been one of the 5 aeroplanes that was in the British Flying Corps, and that was their total fleet. And they were all made out of canvas and wood, so I suspect it wasn't 5 for very long. His world, though, in essence, was incredibly simple. I mean, his family, he was brought up in the very poor end of London, the East End of London. His family, I mean, they wouldn't have had a car. They had a small house. It had one source of water in the house. It had one source of heat, which was a coal stove in the main room. And the life, in essence, was very simple compared to what we have now. If they had insurance at all, it would have been a bit of life insurance. That would have been it. The complexity that we now have requires that we think in as efficient as possible a way. More efficient, the better, because otherwise life becomes overwhelming, and it can become pretty overwhelming anyway. But the important thing about the analytical deductive process is that it is very, very efficient, in that what we tend to do is we have a new situation in front of us. Our mind goes back into its filing cabinets and says, have we had a situation like this before? And if we have, either we've experienced it or we've read about it or people have told us about a similar situation, we will tend to use that as a schema for what we currently do. So we will tend to say, okay, that's what we did before, so this is what we're going to do now. And you can see it's a pretty efficient way. It's a script. A schema is a script. So the analytical deductive process is inherently convergent in that when we're analyzing something, we tend to be cranking up the microscope. We, as we say, drill down into the problem. And that is part of the problem with burnout, anxiety, and stress. How many of you have had clients that have had high degrees of stress, anxiety, or even burnout? Just give me a sort of pretty common, isn't it? I mean, you don't have to be teachers coaching for very long before stress becomes quite a regular phenomenon. So does anybody here kind of recognize that concept of when we get stressed, our focus goes in? We've put blinders on the racehorse. We're looking at increasingly, it's as if the microscope is, we've cranked up the magnification. And so we're seeing smaller and smaller parts of our world. Does that ring true for any of you guys? So that is it's a phenomenon called seizing and freezing. And we seize, if we're looking at a challenge, looking at a problem, we seize on the first thing that comes into our mind, and we don't look at any other options. So that's another contribution to this whole process of convergence. So the idea of convergence is really it's a negative feedback process. It's actually a positive feedback process, but it's not positive in a good sense. It's positive in a sense that, the same phenomenon that causes a nuclear reactor to go crazy. One little thing happens and then it gets worse and worse and worse. And that's really what we've got with burnout. I call it the hamster wheel effect. Our client gets onto the hamster wheel and it goes round and round and round, and they can't get off that hamster wheel. They're stuck in that process of thinking. So let me just not get too far ahead of myself here. So one of the things that is really very, very helpful is to get clients in that kind of situation to switch from that convergent schema-based process where we're doing as much as we can on automatic to a creative, intuitive, divergent process. And one of the reasons that I've been focusing on this, and creativity is something I've been researching for 20 years, but applying it in this way is really just over the last 5 years. And one of my clients he came to me because he had actually left a religious cult, and that cult was it's a very isolated cult. A lot of religious cults tend to try and be isolated. And this one really, really succeeded, physically isolated from the rest of the world. Isolated in the sense that it was even very difficult for people to talk to friends and relatives outside of the cult. Anyway, he'd broken free from this cult. And it was very, very traumatic for him because his family was still in the cult. And like a lot of cults, whether you're talking Scientology, whether you're talking the Nike folks or the Branch Davidians in Waco or whatever, one of the common factors is that cults often have rules or norms that actually prevent cult members from having close associations with people outside the cult. Does that sound familiar to you in terms of if it's a very common phenomenon? And so Bob's trauma really came from the fact that he still had family members inside the cult. His whole life had changed when he decided to leave the cult. And in many different ways, he wasn't terribly equipped to deal with a life outside. I mean, he physically, had never sort of had a formal job. He and all his friends and connections have been within the cult. And Annette says sounds like some religions. And I'm talking about a religious cult, so you're absolutely right. So one of the things that we did was I very quickly I found that he was into the same script every time we had a meeting, and the script was related to his own trauma in missing his family, his trauma in terms of not having any friends outside the cult since he'd left the cult, and things of that nature. And so I sort of broke the tradition and started to talk to him about things that he'd done um, previously that he really, really enjoyed. And some of them, he was a very competent musician. He'd actually in within the cult, he was the choir master, and he did anything to do with anything that was musical in the cult. He had something to do with. But he also had um, got a video camera, and he got very involved in videoing stuff. Some of this was videoing things related to the cult. I mean, if they had a religious celebration of some description, he would do the videography. So we talked about his previous passion for videography, and I also tried to talk to him about his music, but that was too close to the point. He loved music. He was a very competent guitarist. He had a good voice to sing with, but he didn't really want to discuss that because it took him right back into the field of his cult. So we talked about his video, and this was all happening just in one session. And so I started to talk to him about whether one of his tasks between, this meeting and our next session could be that he would go out and make a video, do something that really, something that really interested him, and so on and so forth. And as we went into that discussion, his whole mood changed. Everything changed. He became a a different person. And he was started to talk to me about, yes, okay, I've got an idea. And da, 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 da. Next time we saw each other, he had actually he switched the chip um, from the camera to the computer, and he showed me a video that he had done of a track meet, and his acquaintance. He was a cousin, friend of a cousin of his that he'd met when he moved out of the cult, and he was running in a competition, and so basically Bob videoed this, and he said, "I'm going to do some nice edits on it, and then I'm going to give it to him as a birthday present. He got a birthday coming up." And so in the course of doing that video, he had really he was a different person. I mean, he had taken himself out of that hamster wheel and started to look at something that he used to do that used to bring a lot of joy and satisfaction to him. And that really, in the main, because of the cult, he had never managed to develop. So when I kind of thought about it in a different context, one of the things that I did some research on was neural pathways. Now, I'm not going to get into the weeds with the whole neural pathways thing because it's a very could go on for a long time. But broadly, it has been discovered that if you're thinking in this creative way that I'm talking about, then the neural pathways that light up, that are activated, are very different from the ones when you're thinking deductively and analytically. And I found that very interesting because if you read the books, the coaching books, and more to the point, books in the therapy arena, and I started my late life education actually to become a therapist rather than a social psychologist. And some of those books will talk about ways in which essentially you're shifting somebody who has trauma or burnout. You're trying to shift how they think of the world. And it occurred to me that that may not be the most efficient way of doing it. So that's because what was going on in terms of the video, Bob's videography, was not a shift. It was the creation of a new neural pathway. So, it's as if you've had a week of snow, you go out of the front door to go to the mailbox, and basically you're walking from the front door to the mailbox and back again. And as the snow mounts up, you can't, that's the only path you can take. That's you've got a big berm of snow on either side and you're walking down the middle of it. You're trying to change that path. And if for some reason you said, okay, I need to get to the car now, and that's a slightly different path at the end, that is more difficult than creating a new path, which hasn't got the berms to keep you in the path. So that is sort of how I see the notion of creating a new neural pathway. You're actually generating a new way of getting from one place to another. You're not trying to adapt the old path. So you're actually creating a new path. And so the pictures of those fMRI studies, this is all new in the past decade, really. That you've got functional magnetic resonance imaging, functional imaging, which means that's the difference between a fMRI and a regular MRI scan. Is the fMRI, you can actually get people to think in a different way and see how that impacts the neural pathways in the brain. So it's absolutely fascinating from that perspective. So that's really why I focused then on the idea of there being these distinct two modes of thinking. The one is the one we had when we were born, and a very efficient way to gather information about the world. Now, I don't know how many of you have spent much of your life going to a new country. I've actually lived and worked in 7 different countries. So it sort of became a bit of a habit at one point. And one of the things that um, strikes me looking back on it is that when you go to a new country and you're enthusiastic about it and you want to actually get involved in that country, you think in a totally divergent way. You can't bring your old thought patterns with you because it'll be they'll be useless to you. You'll be looking at things, expecting things will all be the same way. And any of you that have traveled, I wonder if you agree with this, but sometimes it has amazed me that you can go to a country with very different sort of social norms, very different processes of thinking and working, and yet somehow things actually work. They have, their life works despite the fact they're looking at something totally different. So the way that notion of using divergent thinking to absorb all that information. That's kind of what we had when we were 2, 3, 4, 5 years old. So that transition where we go to much more convergent analytical thinking has eliminated a lot of the possibilities, our options, when we're looking at making a decision. Because that inward focus means that we're not so likely to be making connections outside of our current thought patterns. And that's what divergence is really all about. So just switching gears for a moment here to look at how we can apply this to burnout and anxiety processes. These are the 3 areas that in my Banishing Burnout program I focus on. And these are custom made for my each individual client. So relationships, as I said before, this is an area which is frequently very challenged by people who have high degrees of anxiety or burnout. And I'd be interested to know from any of you guys that have treated people with a lot of stress, if you would agree with that. So that's the first of the R's. The second of the 3 R's is recreation. When people get into that kind of burnout frame of mind, recreation frequently disappears. If you ask your client, what kind of things do you do for recreation? Well, not very much, really. And, when you dig into it, these are people who would definitely have had some kind of recreation previously. Well, I used to play tennis. I used to do this. I used to, we used to get together with some buddies for, a breakfast once a week. We used to go and play some cards in the evening, all sorts of different things. And frequently that goes because one of the problems with this hamster wheel effect is that people believe they can dig themselves out of their burnout situation by working harder. And I'm sure that's something that some of you will agree with, even if you haven't actually done that yourself, because coaches are not immune from burnout either. So thank you, Raquel. They tend to isolate. You say, yeah, absolutely. So isolation, relationships, recreation, yes, that's now one of the negatives about recreation is not simply that you are you are not getting sort of physical exercise, but you're not getting a lot of the benefits of the process of recreation. There's recreation as opposed to work. I mean, they don't really slide together very easily for most people. Recreation is a new neural pathway. It's a different neural pathway. And it's not often not very, um, it is not necessarily the deductive analytical. Most of the things that most people do for recreation have nothing to do with analytical processes. Now, it could be that your recreation is to get together with a whole bunch of people who also trade stocks on the stock market, in which case maybe that is analytical, but most of the time it isn't. So that's another way in which you can get the benefits of creating these new neural pathways, is to make sure that your client goes back to having some degree of recreation. Now, there's another thing I'm just going to mention here. Um, the left brain, right brain thing in terms of thinking has been debunked. Okay, that's found after fMRI studies came out. The conclusion was that there's no particular area of the brain that's associated with, say, artistic thinking versus mathematical thinking, let's say. So that's been debunked. But nonetheless, um, to get the benefit of um, this way of thinking of two types of thought, you have to understand that you're still using all the brain, but you're using parts of the brain is still in different ways, even if they don't actually neatly divide into right brain, left brain, as it used to be thought. And one of the strange things about the brain, which is, doubtless just a miraculous organ, um, is that the two halves of the brain are actually joined by a piece of incredibly poor technology. I mean, in the world of broadband, this is like having two tin cans with a piece of string joining them. I mean, that thing in the middle is called the corpus callosum, and it's the bundle of fibers that actually communicate between the left half of the brain and the right half of the brain. And interestingly, if a child has been taught music before the age of about 5, their corpus callosum is found to be better developed than those who haven't. Now, that's not a lot of good for us if, we weren't taught music before 5. We can't really undo that. But one of the other things that they found is that if while you are doing some kind of physical exercise that doesn't require much cognitive input, the corpus callosum also increases its capacity for transmission of information. And of course, such a thing might be walking. And it's hypocritical, isn't it, that people think they get these aha moments when they're going for a walk. And I mean, for all I know, it might also happen when you're vacuuming, but I'm not too sure I know about that. So the whole process of walking has this additional benefit that you're going to get. You're going to make it easier to create these new neural pathways. And clearly, recreation doesn't have to be walking, but I personally, I get my clients to say, okay, I will for half an hour every day, I'll make sure I go for a walk. That's one of the kind of tasks between sessions for these various different reasons. So the third R is responsibilities, boundaries. So quite often people with burnout are not stunningly good at setting boundaries. And so that's something that can be worked on separately. There's not much to say about that because it's so personal to the client. But those 3 R's, I think you'll find very useful as you're meeting stressful situations. Does anybody have any questions before I ramble on to the next part? If you do, just unmute yourself and ask them. Okay, so don't worry about interrupting me. Okay, so let's just. I'm not stunningly good here at sticking with the script, so I just want to give you a really practical example of these two types of thinking process in evidence. After the terrorist attacks of 9/11, the skies in the US were closed to commercial flights. And so many of the big airlines went into panic mode. They renegotiated or tried to renegotiate contracts with the unions. They instantly took the opportunity to slough off lots of routes that were less profitable. They found every possible way of slimming things down. And whether you're talking, American Airlines or Delta or whatever, that's the kind of thinking that went on. And it was pretty chaotic in terms of the goals that they may have set in their corporate strategic plan sitting on the top shelf, gathering dust that nobody was reading. They kind of, all those plans went out of the window. The one exception to that was Southwest. Southwest Airlines said, okay, and they bought up some of the routes that the other airlines had sloughed off. Within 10 days, they had $100 million program, participation program for their employees, and they guaranteed they weren't laying anybody off. And in fact, they started to very swiftly absorb some of the flight attendants and pilots from the other aircraft, from the other airlines. Now, to me, that was an interesting comparison between these two. The other airlines had gone into ostrich mode, and they basically just they were taking knee-jerk reactions and using those to guide the business. I kind of look at it, if you're in a sailboat and you suddenly hear that there's a hurricane just around the corner, you've got two options. One is to kind of go down below decks and shut everything up and just wait until it has blown over. The second is that you hook yourself to the lifelines around the boat and you put up a little bit of sail and you use the wind of the hurricane to the edge of the hurricane to take you to your destination. And so clearly, the likes of Delta and American they decided they were going to just get rid of all the kind of slim down as much as they could in a short space of time and just hunker down and wait till it all blows over. And Southwest had found ways of turning that adverse situation into something that was potentially at least positive. And that really fueled their growth for the next few years. So two different ways of looking at things. One's the knee-jerk reaction, the deductive analytical process, and the other was a step back process. So can you see the difference there between the convergent process of that was caused by the stress and the divergent process that Southwest used in terms of looking at all the options? Does that make sense for everybody? Okay. Any questions that are coming from this summary? this discussion. Do is your yes, Missy, that you have a question or?
Yes was just that everything was clear. I don't have a question, Andre. I just loved everything that you provided. I'm so grateful even for that visual that you were mentioning about like the snow and plowing in one path. And like that really helped me connect exactly what you were sharing
Okay.
of difference between having one way and creating a whole new path. So that was very supportive for me. So just appreciate that. That anchored me really well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Any other questions or comments or? Okay. Um, let me just.
Can I can I add
Yes.
on something, Andre?
Yes, please.
Um, I really loved everything that you shared, and I would like to share a moment of connecting the dots for me,
Yes.
where interesting enough, I've joined a couple of months ago a webinar, a talk by a burnout coach, and it really helped me to see the scopes of the extensions, as you said, of burnout. It wasn't just like, oh, I have a burnout, as you were saying. It's not a slight term that we can use in every occasion. But I love how you phrased the recovery ways, the 3 R's. And the somehow I connected the dots with what I see with coaches, with maybe entrepreneurs at the same time, but in our cases, newly graduate coaches who can fall into burnout even or get closer to burnout, because we strive for like creating a business and create an empowering coaching practice. But I think if we were to get closer to that burnout stage, I do peer mentoring with coaches, and there were three things that I always kept in as a checklist to how I show up as a coach and how I help others. And it was basically I connected with the 3 R's, what you shared, relationship, recreation, responsibilities. I say, always practice coaching, keep coaching, surround yourself with like-minded people, especially coaches, and also invest into your own coaching practice, whether through having your own coach or supervisor. And for me, this clicks on the theory that you just gave us about 3 R's. The relationship is about surrounding yourself with the like-minded people. The recreation goes somewhere in between the being playful when it comes to our coaching practice, and the responsibility goes into the part about, investing into our own development as a coach. And the reason why I'm sharing is because now I realized on that early stage of setting our businesses, getting more powerful coaches, we can be prone to get burnout if we're not being careful about it. So yeah, I just wanted to share the connected dots moment for me. Sorry that took too long, but yeah.
No, thank you very much indeed. And I think you, um, I think what you said also highlights another point, which is that, as coaches, we have um, the temptation, at least, to feel responsible for our clients. And in a sense, I think that is all part of the process of showing empathy. So if you show empathy and you want to be authentic, then it is natural that you're going to feel some sense of responsibility towards your clients. So once you've got that, and that's one of the keys really to being prone to burnout, because if you think about it, if you look, for instance, at what people do in the medical profession, if you have well, some lines of work, if you're not able to fully concentrate on it, it's not necessarily uh, life-threatening. I mean, it could be okay. You just didn't happen to do your work quite as well today, but it doesn't not necessarily life-threatening. If you're a surgeon, for instance, you're a cardiac surgeon, then it's kind of important that you're able to focus on your work. And in burnout, you have a phenomenon called presenteeism. Now, we all know what absenteeism is. It's quite simply when you're not there, you're absent from your work. Presenteeism is when you're physically present, but your mind is really not all there. Your mind is on something totally different. And that's one of the characteristics of severe burnout, where you're talking to somebody that has severe burnout. It's almost as if you're talking to the shell of their former self. Their mind is in a different place. And clearly, under those circumstances, where if you're a cardiac surgeon, then presenteeism is a pretty threatening kind of circumstance. I mean, if your mind's not on the job doing something that serious, and to some extent, we can sometimes position the coaching relationship as having that same sense of urgency, particularly if we're trauma coaches or things of that nature. So I think it's a very interesting point that responsibility that we feel for our clients, although on one level, if you feel too responsible, that's going to be a negative phenomenon. But nonetheless, that is one of the things that can trigger the processes of burnout. If we take that responsibility so seriously, that it can create problems. Thank you for your contribution there, and not too much ironing, by the way. Okay, anything else anybody wants to add to that? So just as a very brief review, we're looking at burnout and to a lesser extent anxiety, but also stress as a perceptual crisis, not just a physical one. So I think it's fairly straightforward to see that people who are suffering the effects of stress are focused on what's happening in the future, aren't they? Stress is always about what's happening in the future. We are worried about, I mean, it goes back to when we were kids, someone says, don't forget you've got a dental appointment on Friday. And for the next few days until Friday comes along, you're thinking, oh no, I've got to go to the dentist. Stress is about what's happening in the future. So crucial to the process of coaching stress or burnout is the idea that we want to try and keep clients in the present. Because generally speaking, I mean, well, so under normal circumstances, 99.99% of the time, the present is actually a reasonably safe place to be. We can make it a non-safe place, but in essence, we could also make it a safe place. So that's a crucial thing. For me, one of the silver linings of the whole burnout episode was that there was one friend in Florida who wasn't going to succumb to my pushing away everybody around me in my life. He stuck with it and said, no, I'm just going to be here whether you like it or not. And one of the things he did one day was gave me a piece of paper with a phone number on it. And he said, this is Dana Berzo. I've known her for many years, and she is a meditation coach. And she taught me to meditate. Took 3 days, had to go and see her for 3 days. And just the first day, was the only time that I'd slept well in about the previous 18 months. I mean, its effects were immediate to me. So, and I'm sure I'm probably um, coaching the choir here, talking to the choir in terms of meditation. But it's something that has been with me. I've conducted it, in the 40 years since that time, and it's been of wonderful assistance. Um, so that's something that I never hesitate to kind of gear my focus my clients on. And for a while there, introducing meditation into particularly executive coaching, um, was a difficult thing to do. People would hear meditation and they'd suddenly get all this kind of acid Beatles music in their minds, and they had memories of, caravans full of long-haired hippies coming back from the Maharishi and all this kind of thing. So, but one of the great benefits that the people who brought mindfulness into the world was they never mentioned meditation. So in the business community, it's very easy to talk about mindfulness. And that's all a bit, so, oh, yes, okay, that's fine. But still, meditation can be this kind of, this smell of patchouli oil and stuff comes into their minds. So I've always found that to be an incredible benefit. Be interested to know if other people have found that to be of benefit. And it's becoming an accepted stress reduction, isn't it, these days? So the importance of burnout being a perceptual crisis is really part of the process. So and that really involves talking to the client not just about the things that are creating stress in their lives, but about how they're dealing with it, and reminding the clients that there is a future and that they're crucial to deciding what that future is. That future doesn't have to be decided by the outside world, doesn't have to be decided by the cause of the stress. We can decide that no matter what. So that's one factor. And that stress arises from demands outweighing perceived resources. And once again, that's our perception. So we can transform the experience of stress by expanding a client's perception. That's the other thing that we can do. So most of this is now about expanding how we think of the world, how our clients think of the world. That process of expanding is a part of the process. So the other things, and this is saying, this is my big takeaway, that it's the perception that has to be the focus in the coaching session. Yes, absolutely, Annette. I think that's totally true. There are other things, though, that we can do to help our clients get onto that process of thinking with creativity. Now, I've mentioned Bob and his video, right? So the idea that everybody, all our clients have done something creative sometime in their lives, whether it's writing and that kind of thing. I mean, journaling, for instance, is something which is the silver bullet that coaches. I'm not a journaler. I've never journaled. It's of no interest to me at all. I love to write, but I don't happen to be a journaler. But I think writing, I'll quite often write if I want to just get my brain creating a new neural path. I will go into the focus of writing, but it's not necessarily journaling. But there are lots of other things that people have done in their lives that are creative. So helping people back to that, and generally speaking, people who want to employ you for coaching them through burnout, they want guidance. So don't be scared to give them a fair amount of direction. We're taught not to do that as coaches, aren't we? I mean, it tends to be a kind of a bit of an oh no to actually tell people what you think they should do. And I'm not suggesting you tell people what to think they should do, but give them give them guidance. People in burnout are actually very vulnerable. And so, the coaching version of putting your arms around them is basically to give them guidance. So I will give my coaching clients guidance along the lines of, I want you to do this between now and our next session. Are you happy with that concept? And this might be anything related to what they've told you about their previous lives in terms of doing things creative. One of the things I quite like to do with my clients is have them create a dream board. And I can show you one example of that. And it was it had a lot of pleasant things associated with it, very positive things associated with it. Let me just pull that up real quick. I should have done that. Has anybody ever done a dream board? Okay, sorry, just taking a second to pull this image up. So a dream board is basically a some kind of a poster board. It's kind of nice if it's an actual physical item rather than just something you're generating on your computer. And it's taking a long time to load, but it should be coming up any second now. Okay. Here we go. So can everybody see that?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Okay. So basically, this one happened to be somebody prepared this that they were thinking of moving the whole family down to Costa Rica. And it was a cause of considerable anxiety to everybody in the family. And so I had them make this board. It's basically, if you suddenly think about Costa Rica, what are you thinking about? Are you thinking about, well, I'm thinking about the weather, okay? I'm thinking about what sort of house can we buy? I'm thinking about, does that mean we're going to sell our house here, or what's it going to be like? That. So anything that comes to mind there, you stick on this board. It can be a piece of writing. It can be one of my clients in the very middle of it had a little electronic picture display, like a little framed picture that would cycle through lots and lots of pictures of a particular place. And it doesn't have to be a place, of course. It can just be, a dream board about something that you actually want to do. I want to become, leave my job as an accountant and actually become a full-time painter. So you might have, little pictures of your studio. You might have, all sorts of different things, perhaps kinds of scenery you want to paint or anything that comes to mind. So as you can probably imagine, that's a great way to shift your thinking process into a divergent context. So you're basically this dream board is a bit, in a sense, it's similar to brainstorming. Anything that you think of that's related to that topic comes out and gets put on the dream board. So there are many other ways, very simple ways that we can also. Oh, the nice thing about the dream board, of course, is it doesn't have to be just one person making it. So somebody that's in a high anxiety, stress, worry burnout situation can have the whole family participating in this. You know, if the dream board is something that relates to the family. So that can be another way of repairing the relationship side of things as well at the same time. But there are lots of other ways that we can help clients get off that hamster wheel. We can have them change really anything to do with their everyday life, because the goal here is to stop decision making being knee-jerk, automatic kind of process, and is actually consciously thought about. So even things like sort of, okay, well, why don't we as a family go out to a restaurant, choosing a different restaurant? Or if you get to the restaurant, choose something different on the menu than you normally have. Perhaps perhaps change your wardrobe around a little bit. Have a different kind of, as opposed to sort of automatically going for the same pair of jeans and one of three shirts, change that about a bit. But even these little things add up to a much bigger process. One of the things I'm just going to mention is that I am going to be running a workshop on this whole process. I've only really managed to cover the very basics of this. I call it, this is spherical thinking. This is a way of creating different ways of approaching the world, and the broad context is much wider than burnout and that kind of thing. It has a lot of very you're not necessarily using it to coach negative phenomena. Sometimes you're using it to expand people's minds that is not necessarily related to addressing challenges. But this is going to be a certification workshop, and it's going to be 3 sessions of 3 hours each, and it's going to focus on this process of spherical thinking, and we'll go through practical one-on-one exercises in terms of how we would use this in a coaching context. And really, the goal is to be able to introduce this into your coaching practice. Now, my new book, which is just coming out, is called Creative Thinking: A Coach's Perspective. And that's just it's now listed on Amazon. It's going to be actually launched next week, and that goes into this in much. So anybody doing the workshop will get a free copy of my work of my book. And as I say, it's also a certification program. So if you are a coach going for instance, accreditation with AC or one of the other organizations, then this will count towards that accreditation process. I just a couple of minutes about me. As I mentioned before, I was an entrepreneur for 15 years, and I started consulting when I sold my businesses. There were companies that had kind of followed my progress over the years, and particularly moving from Europe and setting up the American subsidiary to my company. That's something that most of the smaller businesses tend not to do very well when they come from England particularly, but Europe in general. And it's a daunting process. And so a lot of companies were kind of talking to me about that process and wanted a helping hand with that. A few years later, I went back to school and did a PhD in social psychology, and organizational level creativity was my focus, not entirely surprisingly. And so that's really my background. So this class will come with that, with a certification. And if you're interested, then just drop me an email, and I can, just in case you haven't got my email, There we go. Yes, I like that comment. Rachel says, when you're in the creative flow, stress takes a back seat. Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, okay. So are there any more questions or comments or observations that anybody would like to make? So if you're interested in doing this certification program, it's something that I'll be starting probably to at the it'll be a month away at least. I have I'm actually giving a TEDx talk in the middle of August, so this will be probably the last week of August. This will start, and it's normally $595, but I'm running it this time for 395. And so, if you're interested in that process, I can put you send you information and put you on an email list to keep track of that. And one of the things that will be I at some point when my Banish burnout program comes up, I will be looking for coaches to share with me the coaching of people with burnout. And it's just a vast epidemic at the moment, and getting the sort of numbers that are coming out in the surveys are that it's getting worse by 10 to 15% every year in terms of numbers. So it is something that I think we can all um, we can all really make a contribution to helping that. And I hope this has really given you a few things to think about as to how to address burnout, stress, and anxiety. And I will be that there is um, a training manual that I can send you, anyone that's registered for this. I can send you a link to that. That'll probably be a week away. There are some alterations I want to make for that. And I will also send you a link about my book, which is very much focused on what we're talking about now. It includes the burnout material, but it also looks at a number of other different ways. There's this process once you have started to make these transitions towards a uh, creative thinking neural pathway. There are all sorts of ways in which you can benefit from it. Just the ability to be able to look at the world through these two different lenses gives you dramatically better options. So, if you're making a decision, this will give you more choices to look at. So it has a lot more in it than just burnout, but it mentions burnout. It goes much more deeply into the origins. So, any more questions? Well, thank you very much for joining, and it's great to meet you all, and I hope this has been of interest. So
It's been
have a great
great.
day. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
very much. Thank you.